So Trout Pillow has decided to show up to this video about trout. And today we're talking about trout streams in Richland County. And this is the same thing as the previous trout survey videos I made. These are surveys from 2014 to 2019. They're still useful at showing which streams have trout and which streams do not have trout in them. If there's not a species of trout listed in the survey on a certain creek, it means they didn't catch any of that certain trout species in that creek. There's many streams in this county that only have brown trout in them, if I recall right. And there's some brook trout, and I don't even think there was any rainbow trout caught in any of the surveys in this county. But the fish were collected by electrofishing. And to estimate the population, they shock a certain distance of stream and count the number of fish and measure and weigh the fish. And then they use that to get the number of fish per mile, the number of fish over a certain size per mile, and so forth. And how I've categorized these as brook trout per mile, brook trout over 10 inches per mile. I don't think there's any brook trout pounds per mile. And then there's brown trout per mile, brown trout over 12 inches per mile, brown trout over 16 inches per mile, and brown trout pounds per mile in certain streams. And I also have the maximum size brook trout and maximum size brown trout they caught in each creek. And I included pounds per mile where it was available because that's a better indication of the size of fish compared to the number of fish they caught. Because there's some streams where they catch like 2,000 trout per mile, but there's only 50 pounds per mile, which means they're all really small fish. But that also could be the time where the survey is, or be the creek where all the baby trout hang out at. So I'll see you in the next video. This is going to be a very long one. The first creek is Willow Creek, and I have made a few videos of me trout fishing there. It is a good stream for brown trout, as these surveys show. There's quite a bit of eased land and public land along the creek. The lower part of the stream, there's a really wide variety of habitats, and there's some really nice pools like along cliffs and just where there's nice deep bands. And then there's also lots of stretches of riffle habitat. As what I've said with many of these streams, I've caught a lot of brown trout, not many bigger than 12 or 14 inches. And I think I did catch like a 14.5-inch brookie out of this creek. That might have actually been in Sauk County. That was in the way upper part of the creek in like 2018, I think. But no, and I caught one a long time ago out of there too, by where the catch and release area is north of Lloyd. But I think the biggest brown I've caught out of this creek is like 15 inches. And the surveys show there's a lot of small to medium-sized brown trout in this creek. It's definitely a creek worth trying, and it's a good creek for action. And around Lloyd is where they shocked up the most fish. Here's some more surveys on Willow Creek, and they caught quite a few brown trout and a couple brook trout, a few larger brown trout, but most of the brown trout were under 16 inches. But they did catch a few 16 to 20 inches, so it's definitely possible to catch some larger fish. And I think in the lower parts of the stream, you're probably more likely to catch larger fish than the bottom part stretches. I think the trout will be able to swim over Ithaca Dam, but they might struggle. But it's a pretty big creek with a wider variety of species and plenty of food in the lower stretches of it. So it's definitely possible to catch some larger fish out of it, although a lot of fish caught in these surveys are small. The next creek is Camp Creek. This stream has a lot of browns in it, a few larger browns, but mostly small to medium-sized brown trout. Basically the same as a lot of the other streams, and they caught like 1 or 2 brook trout in the surveys, which were small. I've never fished this creek before. I've heard that this is a good creek for action, so if you trust my word, it's probably worth trying. I'm sure you'll just catch a bunch of 14-inch and less brown trout, but you could somehow catch one of the few larger fish they caught in these surveys. The next stream is Byrds Creek. This creek has lots of birds by it. Actually, I don't know whether it has birds by it, but this stream has some brook trout in it and some pretty good sized brook trout and a couple brown trout in it. I have no idea where this creek is, and I have never fished it before. It's probably some little tiny creek. So I know nothing about this creek. The next creek is Bufton Hollow. There's about every hollow name in the world in this county. There's lots of hollows in this county. That's why there's so many trout streams. This stream has brown trout in it that are mostly small. The biggest one they caught was 12.1 inches, and I'm assuming this is a little tiny creek that flows across State Highway 56, but I don't know where it flows across State Highway 56 at, and it has brown trout in it. The next creek is Brush Creek, and this creek flows along Highway 14 and flows past Richland Center High School. And this stream has brook trout and brown trout in it. I've never fished it, and I don't know how much public land there is on it or so forth, but I'm sure it's more fished than some of these streams just because of its proximity to Richland Center. But I could be wrong. The next creek is Ash Creek, and they've actually used this creek to get the brood stock for brook trout. A lot of the brook trout they stock are Ash Creek Southwest Feral. And I think I tried fishing this like 10 years ago, and I caught a whole bunch of brook trout and a few brown trout, but the last time I fished it in like 2019, I think I caught just as many brown trout as brook trout. And these surveys do not show that there is very many brook trout in this stream. And there's a regulation that says you can't keep any brook trout, but you can keep like 5 brown trout per day with no length limit on brown trout. But it flows into the Pine River, which a bunch of these other streams that I'm discussing in this county flow into. And those streams all have abundant populations of brown trout. So there's really no way they can keep brown trout out of that stream. And brown trout are a lot more adaptable to warmer water than brook trout are, and habitat degradation. The next creek is Babb Hollow Creek. This stream has a bunch of little brown trout in it and a few brook trout. I don't know exactly where this creek is, but I'm pretty sure it flows into another creek that's a pretty good trout stream. The next stream flows through a bunch of basswood trees, and that's why it's called Basswood Creek. Actually, I've never been there before, so I don't know if there's any basswood trees along it. I'm assuming there has to be some for the name. This stream has a few brook trout and some brown trout, most of which are small. I'm assuming this is a little tributary stream to something else also. The next stream is Bauer Valley Creek. This is probably a little feeder stream to some other stream too, larger stream. I've never fished this before, never heard of it. I guess if you listen to this video, you'll find a lot of places where I probably don't recommend fishing or say are smaller creeks. And this would probably be one of them, but this just has a few little tiny brown trout in it, but I'm assuming it's a really small creek. The next stream is Bear Creek. This creek also is in Sauk County, and I have fished this before, and I have caught brown trout out of it. We've caught a decent number of brown trout. I think the biggest one we've caught has been like probably 14 or 15 inches. I did lose like a 18-incher in it when I fished it in 2020 though, or 2021 I mean. I fished it last year. And I did lose a pretty big one. It snagged me up on some brush. Next stream is Cazenovia Branch, and I did fish this creek once. It was after there was really bad flooding in fall of 2018, And I caught like 2 or 3 brown trout out of it and like 1 brook trout. And the survey says this has a lot of brown trout, some medium-sized brown trout, but not many larger than 16, which is pretty typical for these streams. The next stream flows out of a valley that's full of black cherry trees. Actually, I don't know whether there's any black cherry trees, but it's called Cherry Valley. And this stream has a few brown trout in it. The next stream is Chitwood Hollow Creek, and there's probably a little tributary to some stream, and this stream just has brook trout in it, and they're all really small. The next creek is Hoke Creek. This stream has brown trout in it, but they're all really small. I'm assuming it's a little tiny tributary stream to somewhere. Next creek is Hawkins Creek, and this stream has brown trout in it. Some all right-sized brown trout, but the biggest one was 13 inches. I don't really know where that creek is either. The next creek is Hawkins Creek. I also don't know where this creek is. I made a slide of every stream they surveyed. I don't know if I included unnamed streams in this county, but I did in other counties. So I'm showing data for all these little tiny feeder creeks that says are trout streams on the maps, but probably no one would ever think of fishing. But all it's probably doing is deterring people from fishing them and making them fish all the spots where everybody fishes. Actually, this creek has some decent sized browns and it has a good population of brown trout. The next creek is Happy Hollow Creek, where everybody is really happy when they fish it. This creek actually might flow into Willow Creek, but I could be wrong. But this stream has brown trout in it and a few brook trout. They caught a 14-inch brown trout, but I'm pretty sure it's a pretty small creek. The next creek is Hanzel Creek. It's right next to Grinsell Creek. Actually, I don't think there is a Grinsell Creek in Richland County. But this stream has brook trout and brown trout in it, although none of them were very large and there really wasn't a whole lot of them. The next creek is Hall Bottom Creek. And this stream has a good number of brook trout, but they're all really small. Actually, that's a lot of brook trout for this part of the drift list, but they're all really small. And there's a few brown trout. Next creek is Grinsell Branch. And this stream has a few brook trout and not a lot of brown trout in it. The next stream is Goose Creek. And you get honked at a lot by some mean geese if you go there, so that they might scare you away. And this creek has a lot of brook trout in one location, one survey. I should probably check the max size brook trout because that seems really high. And the other survey at the same location in the previous year had a lot of brown trout. I'm pretty sure this is right though when I checked it. I'll double check this. But they're all pretty small. The next stream is Gobin Hollow Creek, or Gobin. And this stream has a few brook trout in it. Next stream is Gault Hollow Creek. And this stream has both brook trout and brown trout in it. I'm pretty sure this is a pretty small creek, but it definitely has some trout in it. The next creek is Fox Hollow Creek. And this stream has a good number of brown trout, but they're mostly small. There's a few larger ones, but I don't think it's a very big creek either. The next creek is Elk Creek. And you see Wapiti if you go there. And that stream has a lot of brown trout in it, although there's not a lot of very big brown trout in it. Why are there 2 Elk Creeks? There's a second Elk Creek has a lot of brown trout in it too. East Branch Mill Creek I think flows right along Highway 14, and this flows into Mill Creek. And this stream has brown trout in it and some brook trout, Mill Creek, which it flows into, has a lot of brown trout in it and not many brook trout. And the fish are not that big. There's a few 12 to 16 inch fish, but not a lot. The next stream is Hollow Creek. That stream has brook trout and brown trout in it. There's a lot of both, although neither of them are very large. I'm pretty sure that's a relatively small stream though. The next creek is Hollow Creek, and that stream has a decent population of brown trout, but they're not very large. I think this is also not a huge creek. The next creek is Beebe Hollow Creek, and this stream has some brook trout in it and a few brown trout, but none of them are that big. The next creek is Melachthon Creek. I have fished this creek, I think, twice before and caught brown trout. There's also some brook trout in it, and there's a regulation to protect brook trout in it where you can't keep brook trout, but you can keep 5 brown trout per day. And all I think I've ever caught out of it was brown trout. But there's some really nice deep holes in this stream and lots of run riffles. It has really nice habitat and there's some pretty cliffs along the side of the stream, and it flows into the Pine River. The next creek is McGlynn Creek, and this stream has brook trout and brown trout in it. It has more brown trout than brook trout. And it has some alright sized trout though. I don't know what creek this flows into though. The next creek is Lost Hollow Creek, and I do know that this creek flows into Willow Creek. And I fished Willow Creek below where this flows into, where Lost Hollow flows into it, and I've caught brown trout there. And this stream says there's a lot of little brown trout, so I'm assuming there's some of those little brown trout from Willow Creek swim up into it. But there could be larger fish in it too. The next creek is Little Willow Creek. This stream has a few brook trout and a few brown trout. This flows into Willow Creek farther downstream by Ithaca than where Lost Hollow Creek flows in. The next creek is Knapp Creek. This is right on the edge of Crawford and Richland County. And this stream has an alright population of brown trout and a few brook trout. I think there might be a regulation like 5 trout under 12 or something to try to thin out the population. They did catch a 17.3 incher in these surveys, but most of the fish are relatively small. The next stream is Kepler Branch. I think this flows into Mill Creek, and this stream has some brown trout in it. The next creek is Johnston Creek. I don't know where this creek is at. I'm assuming it's a small creek, but this creek has some little brook trout and little brown trout in it. The next creek is Jimtown Branch. I also don't know where this stream is, but this stream has a lot of little brown trout and some brook trout in it. The next stream is Jaquish Hollow Creek. This must flow into Willow Creek too, because State Highway 58 goes along Willow Creek. And this creek has some small brown trout in it. The next creek is Indian Creek. I have no idea where that creek is. And it has some brook trout in it, but they're not very big. The next creek is Hynek Hollow Creek. And this creek has some brook trout in it. The biggest one is 9.3 inches. The next creek is Hoover Hollow Creek, and this creek has some brook trout in it, but the largest one was 11.4 inches. The next creek is Hoosier Hollow Creek, and people from Indiana like to fish this creek, and this creek has some brown trout in it. The next creek is Hood Hollow Creek, and I think this flows into Mill Creek, and this creek has a lot of little browns in it. The next creek is Mill Creek, and this creek has a lot of little brown trout in it, and I think I have fished this creek like 3 or 4 times before, and it is a very good action creek, but a very poor size creek. Like, it's easy to catch a lot of fish out of, but the quality of fish is not that big, and the fish tend to run kind of thin in there. And if you see, the number of fish is very high, but only like 10% of the fish or less than, like 10% of the fish are over 12 inches. But it's definitely a good creek to go to if you want to catch brown trout, and you can see all sorts of them swimming around in it. Here are some more surveys from Mill Creek, and they also show that it has a lot of brown trout, not many large brown trout. I did catch some brookies. I did think I caught like 3 or 4 brookies out of him like 2012, but the last 2 times I fished it, I haven't caught any brook trout, and they haven't found any brook trout in the recent surveys, although they have in a couple of the tributaries that flow into it. The next creek is South Bear Creek. I don't know where this Bear Creek is. I think it like flows between, I was on the edge of Vernon and Richland County. And this stream has some brook trout and a lot of brown trout in it, but the brown trout aren't big. Next creek is Souls Creek. I do not know where this creek is, and it has some brook trout in it that are small. The next creek is Smith Hollow Creek, and I actually have fished this creek right by where it flows into Willow Creek. It's not that bit large, and it was really clear when I fished it. And as I have said repeatedly in this video, you can probably expect what I caught from it, a bunch of little brown trout. The next creek is Ryan Hollow Creek, and this creek has a lot of little brown trout in it. The next creek is Pine Valley Creek, and this stream has a decent population of small brown trout. The next stream is the Pine River. This river is a pretty large river, but in the population of trout isn't super high in it, but there's definitely some trout in it. But a lot of the tributaries that flow into it have lots of little brown trout. And I know here are people catching some larger brown trout, and it wouldn't surprise me if when the water's cooler, this is probably where you catch larger brown trout. It has nice deep holes and bends and so forth. I haven't actually fished in it before, but there's decent population of brown trout by Hub City. I don't really recall how large it is by Hub City though, but I've never tried actually fishing on it. They did catch some larger fish out of it. And percentage-wise, the amount of larger fish is pretty good, but the total number of fish per mile is not very high. But also, I think getting an actual number of the amount of trout per mile on a larger stream is not as accurate as on a smaller stream. So you essentially have to compare year by year, but there's definitely brown trout in it. So you might want to try fishing. It could be good, it could be bad. You could just catch a bunch of chubs and suckers too. I've never really fished it before. The next stream is Pier Spring Creek. This I'm assuming is a little tiny creek. It has some brook trout in it. The next stream is O'Connor Branch. This stream just had a couple trout in the survey, and they must have caught 1 or 2 brook trout and 1 or 2 brown trout. Next stream is Miller Branch, and this stream has some brown trout in it. They're all really small. The next stream is where there's lots of Tritica mystivium growing in a hollow, and this stream has a few brook trout and a few brown trout, which are small. I'm pretty sure this creek is really small. The next stream is West Fork Knapp Creek, which flows into Knapp Creek. And this stream has brook trout and brown trout in it, although there's some medium-sized fish. I guess the size of them isn't terrible. The number isn't super high. The next stream is West Branch of Pine River. This stream has some brown trout in it and some alright sized brown trout. I would say compared to some of the other streams that are decent sized in this county, the numbers of fish is not super high though. Like this isn't high as compared to like Willow Creek or Mill Creek. The next stream is West Branch Mill Creek. This stream has both brook trout and brown trout and it has pretty good populations of both. The size of the brown trout is not very good though. And there's the source.